Welcome to this special session that is hosted by GMAT Club. Thank you to them and to all of you viewers joining us from around the world. My name is Matt Symonds. I write about business education for Forbes, used to write for The Economist and Bloomberg, and I'm a director at Fortuna Admissions. I'm joined by one of my co-directors at Fortuna, Caroline Diarty-Edwards, who for 7 years was the Director of Admissions and Financial Aid at INSEAD, which is perfect because the focus of tonight's session is looking at all of those wonderful business schools beyond the US and North America. We'll be focusing on some of the top schools in Europe and in Asia, looking at what's out there and why these programs are proving to be so popular. Demand has just boomed in the last 5 or 6 years for these great schools. And of course, with that implied selectivity, everything that you can do to get in. I must say that among the dream team at Fortuna, some of us tease Caroline. I'm thinking of Emma, who was the head of admissions at London Business School. She looks at the INSEAD application, 7 essays, video essays, all of this material. She's like, Caroline, what were you thinking creating such a big application? But that, Caroline, gave you the chance to really understand these wonderful backgrounds and experiences of so many thousands of applicants applying to INSEAD.
That's right. And I think that's why INSEAD has maintained a long application, bucking the trend amongst a lot of the top schools to shorten the application, because it has this incredibly diverse applicant pool. And they want to give people a chance to really tell their story in some depth and show, the multiple dimensions that they bring to the table. And so, whilst it's a bit intimidating when you first look at it and see all of that blank space that you have to fill up, it's a great opportunity at the end of the day to really get, the richness of your story and your experience across.
Right. Well, and in fairness, there's Harvard Business School, whose one essay says, what more should we know about you? Which is a fairly open-ended question. INSEAD and the application that you had overseen for 7 years, it's very clear what the school's trying to understand.
Yeah, they give you plenty of signposts, so that's helpful, definitely. So you don't sort of tangle yourselves up in knots trying to figure out, what you should be saying.
Right. So INSEAD will be one of the schools that we're looking at in tonight's session. And I mentioned my colleagues at Fortuna. They were the gatekeepers, both admissions directors, associate deans at 18 of the top 20 business schools from the US, from Europe. So the likes of INSEAD, LBS, HEC, IE. I think we have 15 colleagues that went that all worked at those top schools, as well as Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, and others. And sharing that level of insider insight is really at the heart of what we do, working with so many thousands of clients to successfully apply to these schools. But even just to give you a sense of your profile and background, in fact, just half an hour ago, I was talking to a wonderfully talented young woman who's looking at 3 of Europe's top business schools, not in one of those traditional feeders of consulting, banking, software engineers. She has her own personal, very brilliant path and how she might find a place at one of these top schools. So for any of the viewers, we encourage you to reach out so that we can talk through your business school plans and really give you a better sense of your chances. So in terms of today's session, I'd mentioned Caroline, and there she is in the days as the admissions director. That was the Fontainebleau campus that photograph was taken, Caroline?
That's right. Yeah, that's just at the entrance to the school in Fontainebleau.
Right. And of course, when we all get to travel again, there are similar logos in Singapore, Abu Dhabi, and I think you actually attended the gala opening of the San Francisco research-focused campus before it then had to close briefly or temporarily.
That's right. It was the last event I went to before the lockdown.
That's right. I think it was the last event that the INSEAD dean attended before he went into his personal lockdown. But anyway, so we've got a lot of ground to cover as we go through. Now, I mentioned earlier, Caroline, just this incredible rise in demand for programs whose ROI, sometimes the course length. Talk us through what you think is really driving that demand and the popularity for these international MBA programs.
Yeah. So it's an interesting choice. They're quite different options. And I think it's important for candidates to understand the differences between pursuing international MBA versus pursuing an MBA at a US school. So it's quite a different value proposition, and suits different candidates. So I mean, the main difference and the reason that a lot of candidates apply to these international programs is because you'll be in a very international classroom. So for example, INSEAD and London Business School, 90% of the people attending the program are not from that country, right? So they're not French, they're not British, they're from all around the world, quite literally. So that exposes you to an incredible diversity of experience of people who've worked in very, very different sectors, who've worked in incredibly different cultures, who themselves have experience of working across borders as well. So that adds a lot of richness to the learning experience. And that's a key motivation for many people in attending these programs. And I think it makes a lot of sense if you think that you may be working across borders in the future, or there'll be some global or international aspect to your career. And if that's not the case, and sometimes I talk to candidates who, I'm here in the Bay Area in California. I talk to candidates who are based in the US and who want to stay in the US and don't see themselves going outside of the US for their careers. And in that case, I would advise them to go to a US program rather than an international program, because perhaps that international experience is not as relevant for them. But if there is an international dimension to your experience and to your plans, then having that international learning experience is incredibly valuable. And
it's an interesting choice, because many of us have probably done undergrad and bachelor's closer to home, and maybe in the countries that we grew up. But grad school and business school is this wonderful opportunity to extend those horizons. And as you said, 65 nationalities at LBS, 92 nationalities at INSEAD. You end up in this wonderfully eclectic and international classroom.
Yes, that's right. And talking to faculty as well who teach at INSEAD London Business School, they love that richness as well, because you have such different perspectives than you get in the US classrooms. And although a lot of the US schools, they do have quite a substantial percentage of international students. Some of those would have already been working in the US beforehand, so they're not necessarily coming directly from Brazil or from China. Some of them will be, but it will be a minority of the classroom. And so what I hear from faculty is that in the US schools, whilst you have incredibly bright and talented students, you're more likely to get to the point where there's this sort of groupthink mentality, where people kind of think in the same way about things. Whereas that doesn't happen in the INSEAD or London Business School classroom, or Oxford, Cambridge, etc., because you have that extraordinary diversity. And it's a very challenging classroom, right? I also hear faculty complaining, right? I mean, you really have to be on your toes, because of all those different perspectives, you will constantly be challenged. And so it's a much tougher teaching experience for the faculty than it is to teach in the US.
Right. So the international dimension with faculty is very popular. I can just picture them talking about a boat stuck in the Suez Canal and how it interrupts supply chain, one belt, one road, and it's bringing all of that to life. Another stakeholder group for whom it's also very popular is recruiters, because if they know that you successfully thrive in that multicultural environment, how that will then facilitate the next steps of your career.
Yes, that's right. And recruiters come to recruit for offices all over the world. So, they know that they can come to these schools and recruit people who can go, straight into an international market and be effective. And they value those skills hugely. So, when McKinsey comes to recruit at INSEAD or London Business School, they're not just recruiting for the local offices, but they are, literally sending people all over the world. So it's a tremendous, springboard and platform to access those global opportunities and switch markets if that's something that you're looking to do.
Right. So when you accept that position and you arrive in Mumbai or Dubai or Buenos Aires, it's your school network that's probably if you know nobody in town, it's that school network that would be the first group that you reach out to.
Yes, that's right. And I think that sometimes MBA candidates don't think enough about the alumni network and the role that will play in their career in the future. mean, you gain a huge amount from the MBA experience itself and the knowledge that you gain and the opportunities that you get access to. But 10 years or 20 years down the line, what will really make the difference is the network and the group of people that you can tap into. And, you know, a lot of these international schools have built up over the years incredibly international networks. So, so my husband did his MBA, as you know, Matt, at Stanford. And, you know, we're now back in the Bay Area, having that Stanford network in the Bay Area. I mean, there's nothing like it really, because so many of the alumni stay local, right? They stay within quite a small radius of the campus. But we have lived in a lot of different places. So we've lived together in France, we've lived in India, we've lived in Indonesia, we've lived in Singapore. And in those different countries, actually, he's tapped in much more to my INSEAD network than his Stanford network, because there are very few Stanford graduates dispersed around the world. Whereas INSEAD has this, because it's a larger class. I mean, it's a large program, and people are every year going all around the world. You know, over time, it's built up that really strong network, literally all over the world. So that's very valuable to be able to tap into. You know, if you're looking for new job opportunities or you need to learn something about the markets, people are very responsive and they're very willing to help.
Right. I think there's a whole nother webinar we could organize about how love brings together these MBA graduates from different schools to then pool the networks. It sounds even better.
Right.
Now, in your husband's case, of course, many of the US schools, the Stanford GSB included, it's that 2-year format. There are several options like that in Europe that include London Business School, IESE, but the majority are a shorter format, most a year. A school like HEC that's 16 months, and that is very attractive to people. Perhaps as they reach late 20s, 30, they can't imagine taking 2 years, even though it would be a wonderful opportunity. And a year or a 16-month program makes a lot more sense to them.
That's right. Yes. And then that's a big reason why people choose some of these programs, is that intense format. And I mean, there are great benefits to that, right? As you say, so it's 1 year rather than 2 years, or, you know, it's a shorter period of time versus a longer period of time out of the job market. And then, you know, it's generally a lower cost proposition, because you're paying tuition fees for a shorter period of time, living expenses, foregoing your salary for a shorter period of time. So, I mean, the Forbes ranking is based on ROI, and the shorter programs internationally do incredibly well in that ranking. And you know, the payback on a lot of these international programs is 2 to 3 years, whereas even at the top US schools, it's longer than that. You know, it's at least 4 or 5 years, because of that difference in cost and length of the program.
That's right. I think in the most recent Forbes rankings, they break down into 2-year and 1-year programs, international versus US. And it's quite stark. If you look at the 1-year international programs, IMD at the top of that list, but the first 7 schools all have a stronger ROI in the first 5 years than any of those top US schools. So I guess course length, tuition, and other expenses, and the opportunity cost of not foregoing a salary. So lots of great options, and we're going to try to race through some of the best of them. It's not an exhaustive and complete list. As you know, we host the Centre Court Festival with poets, with bringing together so many of the top European schools. We've just chosen a handful to give everybody a taste. And, you know, given Caroline's gatekeeper background and the rest of my colleagues at Fortuna, some of those insights when they used to run the admissions committee, make those final decisions, who's in and who's out. So we start with INSEAD. That has these 3 campuses. Take us through some of the structure and the highlights, Caroline.
Yeah, so you can choose to start the program either in Fontainebleau or in Singapore. And then whilst you're on the program, you can choose to exchange to the other campuses. And there's also Abu Dhabi, so you can't start the program there, but you can exchange there to that campus during the program. And the majority of students are participating in the campus exchange, because that's a wonderful opportunity to get exposure to a very, very different environment. So in my case, you know, when I did the MBA, I started in Singapore because I'd been working in Paris before the MBA program. So going down the road to Fontainebleau didn't seem half as exciting as the chance to go to Singapore. And that was a wonderful learning experience, right? It's a brilliant opportunity to sort of broaden your international exposure and really add something very valuable to your CV whilst you're studying. And it can be very relevant for people's career goals, right? So if you're looking to make a geographical career switch, then it can make a lot of sense, right? If people are interested in working in Asia, then they should spend more time, for example, on that Singapore campus. So it's wonderful to get access to local networking opportunities. So there's 2 intakes per year. So you can either choose to start in January or in September. It's a 10-month program, but if you start in January, you'll graduate in December, and you have 2 months off in the summer to pursue an internship, which a lot of people do, and that's a great platform for facilitating career change. Having said that, although people who start in the September intake don't have an internship opportunity, the career statistics are very similar in terms of the career change that people are making. So don't think that, if you want to make a career change, you have to do the January intake. It's not the case. Although the school does advise people looking to make a career switch into investment banking to start in January, because the banks are geared up to recruit through the internship. And so that's just one sector where it's worth keeping that difference in mind. And then the benefit of having these 2 intakes is that then you've got 8 deadlines per year. So for each class, you've got 4 separate deadlines. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. And whereas with, the top US schools, there are 2 or 3 deadlines. And really, if you want to give it your best shot, you need to apply basically in round 1 or round 2. With INSEAD, you've got deadlines throughout the year. So it gives you a lot of flexibility about when you apply. And so, you don't need to rush your application to hit a specific deadline. If you need to take a bit more time to prepare your application, to do well on the test, the GMAT or the GRE, then, that's wonderful that you have some flexibility there. And then they have the other campus exchange options. So beyond the switching between the INSEAD campuses, you can also spend a couple of months at Wharton. For people who are looking to work in the US when they graduate, Wharton or Kellogg, that's a great opportunity to switch there and spend some time in the US market and get access to all of their career support while you're on campus at those schools, or SEEPs in China. So, for someone who is targeting working in China when they graduate, that's also a very interesting option.
Right. I remember one of our Fortuna clients who took advantage of the INSEAD Wharton alliance, and after 6-7 months in INSEAD, you've always described it as like drinking water from a fire hydrant.
Yeah.
It's just full on day and night. And when he arrived in Philadelphia, and they said, "Well, you've got class on Tuesday and Thursday," and he was bored. He loved and thrived on that intensity, and it really is a very intense experience. Just as we look at the program and just picking up on January and September classes, you've explained this to me before. Many business schools, typically the top US schools, have just that September entry. So at INSEAD, is it that you had more applicants for September, but the yield was different? Just for people trying to get a sense, right. Is one entry more selective than another? Yeah,
so people are sometimes trying to figure out, is it better to apply for one class rather than the other, or also, better to apply for one campus or the other. So with regard to the classes, the school will generally get more applications for the September entry, and that's because there are more September entries, right, for MBA programs than there are January entries. And so if people are applying to multiple schools, they're more likely to be applying for September entry. But the yield is a little bit lower. So the yield is the percentage of people who will accept that offer. So in fact, the offer rate, the percentage of candidates who get an offer, is the same. So there is no benefit in applying to one intake versus the other. So you should really apply with the timing and targeting the intake that suits you the best. There's really no difference in the level of competition. And then with regard to the campuses, because you have to put in your application, do you want to start do you want your home campus to be Fontainebleau or Singapore? the admissions committee does not see that. They do not see what you've selected and it's been like that from the start, from day one when they launched the Singapore campus, because the school didn't want the admissions committee to be influenced by campus choice, right? It's irrelevant to the decision. So you're admitted to the school, and then the admissions team has to figure out who's going to Singapore and who's going to Fontainebleau, and do we need to ask some people to switch to sort of manage the numbers and diversity? But that is not a factor in the admissions decision.
Right. Now, schools put together, and thank you to Max for putting together so many of the data points that we're going to use in the presentation. There are 3 or 4 that I'd like to sort of 4 threads of this slide that I'd like to bring together and put to you. One is to do with the percentage of women and the efforts INSEAD and other top European schools are making to sort of catch up on some of the gender balance that we now see, the stronger gender balance that we see at some of the US schools. Among those 88 nationalities, some of the overrepresented groups demographically, INSEAD has always said everybody at the school is a minority, and therefore when you're 1 in 4 of every applicant's from one country, that puts a squeeze, and that in turn, how that plays into average GMAT scores and maybe expectations for different profiles. And then finally, the idea of work experience. It's an average. And INSEAD will look at a young woman who's mid-20s, perhaps 3.5, 4 years of experience. It's not you must have 5.5 years, right?
That's right. Yeah. So the range is about 2 years to 10 years. So there is quite a wide span there, and the average is partly a factor of the applicant pool. And we were talking week before last with Virginie Fouger, the head of admissions at the school, and it was a question that came up. She was asked about why is it 5.5 years compared to typically a bit less at the US schools, and she talked about how some of the applicants are coming from countries where they have to do military service, or maybe their study has to go through undergraduate, it's taken 4 or 5 years. Or 6 years, because they may have been juggling study and work while they were doing their undergraduate. So because of that incredible diversity of the applicant pool, you have some people who are applying a little bit later than they might if they had gone through college and begun their career in the US or the UK, for example. So it's partly a factor of that diversity. And then also the school appreciates candidates who have some substantial work experience. Because it's a 1-year program, they want people to be able to relate their learning back to real life experience, and be able to put it in that context rather than just seeing it in sort of a purely academic environment. They want that real life experience that you can share in the classroom, and that people can learn, your fellow students can learn from as well. So they like to have that mix. But as you said, you're not necessarily at a disadvantage by any means if you apply at an earlier stage. If you're applying, say you've only got 2 years work experience, what's important to show is that you've got the level of maturity to fit well in the INSEAD student community, and you've got some substantial experience and some good exposure that other people will benefit from hearing about. So communicate the quality of your work experience. Right.
And I guess with that experience also, as we see 3 well-represented fields, consulting, financial services, and then the broader sort of industrial mix within corporate. On the one hand, you're then in well-represented groups, whether it's the Big 4, MBB, the big banks. But beyond those that make up over 80% of the pool, if you're not from one of those fields, that's something that you can really leverage too, because you're going to be bringing wonderful diversity and fresh perspectives to those classroom discussions.
That's right. I sometimes talk to candidates who are concerned because they say, well, I'm not a management consultant, or I'm not an investment banker. Will INSEAD be interested in my profile? It's like, yes, you don't have to. Actually, in many cases, it's actually a positive, right? As you say, to have a different background and to have a different profile, because these schools are looking to craft a diverse classroom. And it's not just about international diversity. It's about professional experience, and it's about educational backgrounds. So in most cases, having some different experience is valuable, because you'll be bringing a different perspective to that classroom, and it's all about bringing that richness of experience together so that people can learn from each other.
Right.
So they'll be looking at what have you done, what impact have you had. You don't have to have worked in a specific sector or role, but they want to see that you have proven yourself in a professional environment and really achieved something before you apply.
Right. Right. Well, I guess as we look to cover a number of these top schools, naturally, London Business School is also on the list, and many applicants that will consider both INSEAD and LBS among their choices.
Yeah.
More flexibility. I mean, we talked earlier about the handful of programs internationally that offer the 2-year model. That's London Business School, but you can actually decide to do it in 15 and 18 months, right, and reduce the time. But again, 4 deadlines in the year, and perhaps for both schools, and as we look at other European schools later, those 4 deadlines, when you compare to a Stanford or a Wharton that's typically filling 90% of the places in the first 2 rounds, you always observed at INSEAD a much steadier flow, and I think that's true for London Business School and the other European schools as well.
Yes. Yeah. And what I tried to do at INSEAD was to maintain the offer rate to keep it more or less equal through the rounds, because I didn't want to be, accepting people in round 1 who I would reject in round 4 or vice versa, right? You want to take the best of the whole pool, not just the best of the first 2 rounds or the first 3 rounds. So I think there's less pressure to apply early at these schools than there is at some of the US schools. Having said that, if you've got a very common profile, then it may be better to avoid the final round, right? And that's true for INSEAD, and it's true for London Business School. So if you're an Indian IT engineer, or you're a British management consultant, then it might be better to apply in rounds 1, 2, or 3 than round 4. Just because things can, the school can't exactly predict how many people are going to apply round by round, and so when you get to round 4, there are a finite number of places left, right? They have no flexibility. So if you have got that sort of profile, then but it still gives you 3 rounds to choose from for each intake, which is still better, more flexibility than you have at some of the US schools.
Right, and with all of the events we've hosted, or just catching up with David Simpson, who's now the head of admissions at London Business School, he's always pulling his hair out. The Brits never apply until round 3, round 4. He has to promise the dean that they'll have 6 or 7% UK students in the program. Maybe it's just because they buy an Oyster card and get off at Baker Street tube station. But he's always encouraging them to apply earlier than they do. I mean, this is part of it, I guess, that London Business School and the others. INSEAD has what they only start to consider scholarships after round 2, whereas LBS is looking at scholarships from round 1 and could award the Mo Ibrahim scholarship, which is a full ride, to someone in round 1, just as they could only offer that to someone in round 4. So scholarships, I guess, is also something that might be in applicants' minds in terms of when they apply.
Yes, that's true. And actually for INSEAD, it's better to apply in the first 2 rounds for access to financial aid. We'll have more options for financing earlier rather than later. So that's a good point.
So London Business School is growing. I can remember when it was only about 380 students, went up to 6 sections of 80 for 480, and now over 500. Good job that they've got that extra space across the road at Marylebone Town Hall, which also hosts their wonderful incubator. Very similar in terms of this diversity of nationalities. Again, GMAT scores, and I mean, let's touch on the GMAT. It was we mentioned 709 as an average. Again, an average, and how your peers at London Business School and the other top schools are using the GMAT as part of a bigger assessment.
Yes, that's right. So it's one element, right? So the schools, and they talk about it, and they actually do this, right? They look at your whole profile. So they'll be looking at, your academic experience, your professional experience, your extracurriculars, your career goals, etc. And when they're looking at your academics, they'll be looking at your undergraduate track record and your GMAT. So they're looking at them together, right? It's not a sort of isolated data point that they will be examining the GMAT. But the benefit to these schools of the GMAT or the GRE is that it's the common data point that they have. And we talked about the incredibly diverse applicant pool that these schools have. And so people have gone through, a huge range of educational institutions all over the world, come from very different professional backgrounds, very different cultures. And the one thing that everybody has in common is the GMAT or the GRE. So it is helpful for the schools to sort of, sometimes to sort of calibrate candidates one against the other. But sometimes those averages can be off-putting. So, at INSEAD, the GMAT has sort of crept up, and, LBS as well. But there is a range, right? So, the range is typically about sort of 650 up. So if you're within that range, then you may well be a competitive candidate, right? If you're on the lower end of the range, then they would like to see a really strong undergraduate track record that can help to compensate for a GMAT that is not as strong as the average or not as strong as other applicants. So when you're thinking about the GMAT, think about how you will look academically overall. So, where did you study? They'll be looking at the quality of the educational institution that you attended. What did you study? How rigorous was the program? And they will be scrutinizing your transcript, right? They're going to look through all of the grades and see how you did on different programs and different courses. So, if you didn't get great grades on quant courses in your undergrad, then they're going to be looking at, how did you do on what's your percentile on the quant, on the GMAT or the GRE? So they really do look at it as that sort of overall picture.
Right. You mentioned the breakdown and how that matters too, because perhaps the transcript shows certain quant-related courses. Essentially, I guess the admissions office, they want to make sure that you're sufficiently comfortable with numbers to then thrive in aspects of the core curriculum that are going to throw a lot of numbers at you. Yes,
that's right. And I was very skeptical about the GMAT when I went to work at INSEAD. So I had studied there, and 2 years later I went back to work at the school, and students and alumni are often quite skeptical about, GMAT, right? How relevant is it? So we actually did some statistical analysis to look at, okay, well, what are the data points that we have about candidates? And then how does that correlate with how people do on the program and later on? And actually the GMAT is a really good predictor of how people do academically on the program. And the GMAT was designed as a tool for business schools, right? Whereas, the GRE is used by a lot of different programs, and it's got much sort of broader application. The GMAT is really very much about business school, and so there is correlation, right? So you can't ignore it. You can't assume that if you've got fantastic professional experience and good undergrad, you don't have to worry about the GMAT at all. You can get in with an incredibly low score. It's still a competitive process. So, it's not just about your profile. They'll be looking at how you compare to other candidates. And so it's also a signal of motivation, right? The schools see that if you've worked hard on the GMAT and and maybe it's taken you, 2 or 3 or more shots to get the score that you're happy with. That's also a signal to the schools that you've taken the process very seriously and you're committed to the idea of going to business school. And it shows that motivation, which they appreciate.
Right. And then the rewards, of course, we've indicated the sort of average salaries, the number in the UK. Of course, one of the factors, I guess, there's been the whole administration in the US for 4 years that have made international applicants understandably concerned about, H-1B visas, the ability to stay. LBS and other top schools, Imperial, Cambridge, Oxford, they've all seen this real boom because the government in the UK has finally pushed through a skilled migrant visa that gives, I think, great opportunities to then stay beyond your studies.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And so, there can still be visa challenges, and it's worth, if you're concerned about whether you'll be able to make a geographical switch and and how feasible that is, I would encourage candidates to delve into the career statistics. So the schools publish a lot of data about where their graduates go, and which sectors, which employers, which geographies. So do spend some time scrutinizing that data, because that'll give you a much better sense of, can the school help you facilitate your career goals? And, if you've got specific questions, feel free to reach out to the schools, and, they can perhaps advise you on your specific situation.
Right. Yes, we often talk about with the research that you can do, don't just rely on the rankings, but find people either with shared backgrounds, maybe common interests. Perhaps they were, running a particular club at the school, or their post-MBA career trajectory that mirrors yours. Those are great informed conversations to have. Now we move to Switzerland and Lausanne. I have to say, I love IMD. I love the people. I love the program. I love that setting as you look out onto the lake. Who wouldn't want to spend 12 months? It's a January class start with deadlines that run through the year. IMD actually, of course, they've adapted. Anna and the rest of the team have adapted with Zoom in the past 12 months. But IMD actually has these sort of full days, assessment days, that they would run out of Lausanne, out of Singapore. They really take the time to get to know applicants applying to the school.
Yeah, that's right. And they can do that partly because they have a much smaller cohort, right? And there are benefits to that smaller class where you build incredibly strong relationships with the people around you. And so every single candidate, they're thinking very carefully about the role that you will play in the classroom, because it's 90, 100 students, right? Right. As opposed to, several hundred or even 1,000 per year at INSEAD. So every individual has a very important role to play, and they're thinking very carefully about, who will you be in the classroom and who will you be in the community, and how will that all fit together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you talked about class size, which originally had been 90 for many years. It's slowly creeping up, and the admissions indicated that for January 2022, that might get as high as about 115, a year or two older. Now, that said, a 27-year-old young woman that's looking at IMD, again, you said, Caroline, these are simply indicators, but the age range is much broader, based in Switzerland, and therefore, 99% international? What is that? There's one Swiss student, I guess, if we take that. Again, with that much more work experience, and I guess this is broader for the European schools across the spectrum, they do tend to have more work experience than their peers applying to the M7 schools, Stanford, Wharton, Harvard, and others. So, that really is a core element of what the business schools are looking to assess in their admissions process.
Yes, that's right. They really want to understand, what will your fellow students learn from you, right? What professional experience have you had that will be, a valuable addition to the classroom? And I think, one of the really interesting things about IMD is, that the percentage of their 42% manufacturing, right? There's a lot of people coming from industry. It's a much higher percentage than you see on, pretty much any other MBA program that I can think of. So it is a bit of a different student body, and that is valuable to people who are, also looking to make a switch into a corporate sector, not just necessarily. A lot of people at other schools maybe more focused on consulting or finance. At IMD, there's that heavier focus on industry and corporate roles, and that can be very valuable for people coming from that background or looking to make that career switch.
Right. It's I guess with a heritage that includes Nestle and Big Pharma, there's Swiss multinationals, perhaps in part explains that sort of industry mix. Certainly, as a leadership path, I'm often struck with graduates of the school that talk about this journey, in part academic, in part opening up these career options, but just, again, the intensity of the MBA experience and a leadership journey, skill sets that you're building. It seems to be at the heart of the IMD experience.
Yes, yeah, and I mean the benefits of having that smaller class size is that you get really sort of personal attention from the faculty and the staff and the career coaches and so on. So, it's really tailored to your individual needs, and they can do that to a greater extent than some of the bigger programs can. So that leadership coaching and that, support, academic support, support with your career search, it's very, very individualized.
I suppose one thought of anyone thinking of the time frame, well, actually, I'll apply to this school based on the response. Maybe I'll then look at other schools. We're talking about a number of great options to actually cluster some of the applications, because if you then get admits, and our Fortuna clients, they have such tremendous success rates, they then have 2 or 3 offers. And that's where, whether in Lausanne, in Fontainebleau, in Barcelona, they're then going through this sort of admit process to make a choice. It's a nice problem to have. But I suppose if you're applying to 2 or 3 at the same time, that also means that you're able to look at those different options and decide which school for you at the same time.
Yes. Yeah, and I think candidates learn a lot through the application process. I mean, of course, you should definitely do your research before you start applying, so that you've got clear sense of motivation and fit with the school. But the application processes are quite different. And you talked about the assessment day at IMD and so on, and at other schools you may meet with alumni for interviews. You will learn a lot about the schools and the different character of the communities and so on during that process. And definitely, see it as a two-way street. It's not just about the schools choosing you, it's about you choosing the schools, and use those touch points and those opportunities when you interact with the school to ask your questions and to learn more, so that hopefully at the end of the day you'll be able to make a choice between schools, and you'll make a very informed decision.
Right. Well, I mentioned Spain, and that brings us to Barcelona. Again, one of the European options that's available in a nearly 2-year format, or again, much like LBS, you can down to 15 months. IESE has wonderful pedigree. Harvard Business School, I guess, was one of the original institutions that was involved in the creation of the school, and it's a class act. BCG, in a fairly restricted European recruiting pool, certainly has IESE on their list. So 4 application deadlines through the years, incredibly international. It's a wonderful school, Caroline.
It is, yes, and it's a wonderful location. I mean, I absolutely loved visiting the campus there. It's beautiful. Who wouldn't want to spend pretty much a couple of years in Barcelona? It's a stunning campus and a great community. So a wonderful opportunity to get exposure to a different business environment as well, and also a very international community. So many of the benefits that we've talked about of going to schools like London Business School or INSEAD, you will also get access to that tremendous faculty, tremendous peer group at a school like IESE.
Right. You gave the example earlier, and based on the West Coast, where, somebody looking at schools, they're from the US, intend to then pursue and continue their career in the US. Maybe it makes much more sense to look at one of those US business schools. IESE, I guess, historically, they also have very strong ties to Latin America. Is that sort of part of the network of the school?
Yes, and I mean, it's also, something that's evolved organically over time, because being in Spain, they've tended to attract more students from Latin America historically, and so have developed those ties over the years, with people going back to those markets and recruiters in that region. So, definitely a fantastic option. I think that too often candidates in Latin America just look north and think, I should go and study in the US. There is this very strong draw from Latin America to study at one of the North American schools. But the schools in Spain are also a great platform for then coming back to Latin America, as you say, and will give you an additional dimension of that sort of European experience, a more international exposure than you would get at one of the US schools.
Right. And I remember when we talked about the San Francisco hub that INSEAD opened just last year, IESE reminded me that they actually were the first of the top European business schools to have that US presence. They also have offices in Munich. And in fact, this is true of many of the European schools. As they've built this global footprint reinforced by alumni that then are all spread over the world, and alumni that are very loyal to the schools and really involved in the local chapters. You've been to many of these events in different parts of the world. There's real enthusiasm and loyalty there.
There is. The network is incredibly powerful. And I think, that's something that really sets business schools apart. And that's a key part of, why people go to business school and pursue an MBA is, you build those relationships that will pay dividends for the rest of your career, the rest of your life. And the alumni networks are a key part of what you're buying into, essentially. And they are very active. And it's a wonderful way to then support your school, but also get involved and continue to build relationships later on, right? I mean, here in the Bay Area, there's a very active INSEAD alumni community, and for the other schools as well. And it's a great way of connecting not just with some of my former classmates, but alumni from all generations. And the schools will also sometimes do events together. So alumni networks from different schools will do events together. So that can be a wonderful way of meeting people from other top business schools. Right.
Well, we stay in Spain for IE and the business school in Madrid that has really emerged in the last 25-30 years. One-year program and rolling admissions, very flexible. They'll even look at, I think, alternatives to the GMAT. IE, am I right in thinking, Caroline, they have their own internal test?
They do. They have their own test, which is an alternative to the GMAT or the GRE. That's right.
Right. I love the fact that one of their partnerships among the 66 schools is with Brown, which of course put the two schools together and you get a brownie. In terms of the program itself, very international, very diverse. As we look at education backgrounds, we talked about some of the different industry backgrounds at a school like IMD. It's interesting to see how many people studied business at undergrad and now they're going back to business school. Was that something that you needed to explain in the applications? You'd already taken courses in finance and marketing and strategy. Why come back and do it all again?
Well, it's a very different experience. So I don't think you need to justify it, really. I think, schools understand that business administration at undergraduate level will be a very different academic and, overall experience than going to business school. But I guess, if you've done your undergrad in business administration and then you've just worked for 1 or 2 years and then you're applying to go to business school, that may be less compelling a case than, if you've worked for 3 or 4 years, you've got a bit more substantial experience and then you're going back to school.
Right.
It is sometimes important, if you have got a very strong background academically in some of the courses that you would be studying at business school, they may ask you interview stage about your motivation, right? So just be prepared for that because they want to make sure that the students who are coming in are really going to be engaged in the classroom. Right. And are not just coming for the recruitment opportunities and the networking and the social life, right? That can sometimes happen, but they want students who are genuinely engaged in the academic experience as well. So if you feel that, you've studied some of those topics before, just think about how you can convey that academic motivation in your application and in your interview. But it's generally, it's not a big issue and it's not going to sort of count against you.
Right. Our colleague Lisa, who of course had been the director of admissions at IE in an event that we held last week, she reminded me, she made a great point just about how, the schools, they want curious people, people that are there to learn, and perhaps even how you reflect that not just through your undergraduate studies, maybe an online course that you've taken that you read widely around a given subject. Of course, if you include that on your CV or your resume, fair game in the interview for them to bring it up. So you better be able to back it up if you talk about 19th century Russian literature or whatever it might be. But, it wasn't, if you had nothing left to learn, why go to business school? Did you like to see curiosity in applicants?
Yeah, I think sometimes candidates forget that these are academic institutions, right? And I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on your professional experience and your career goals. And, often alumni who are involved in the admissions process, and many of the schools have alumni interviewing, what they care most about is your professional experience. And are you someone who's going to, contribute a lot to the student community and be, a great alum in the future, or be part of their network, someone that they really want to have as part of their network. But the schools are also academic institutions. And so they do want to feel that certainty that you're not only coming for that sort of career springboard, you're also coming because you have that intellectual curiosity and you really want to learn, and you're going to be motivated to really engage in the classroom and take advantage of all those academic opportunities. And sometimes faculty are involved in the admissions decisions, and they want to see that students are high performers academically and have genuine academic curiosity, because those are the students that they want to teach, right? They don't want students who are just coming because they want to, get that interview and land that job with McKinsey, or come and network with this incredible group of students. They want people who are going to, contribute a lot to the debate in the classroom and have, fascinating ideas to share.
Mm. Right. Yeah. Well, I suppose another example of that, and this is back to the UK and SIDE at the University of Oxford. It's always nice when you can lean on over 800 years of tradition in the university. SIDE, of course, celebrates its 25th anniversary this year. So a youth among some of the schools, but I mean, it's really established its place. They chose the one-year format, and they describe them as stages rather than rounds of deadlines. I think one of the things I'm often struck with in many of the applicants looking at top European schools with SIDE, how often we have a conversation about the Skoll Centre, which of course originally supported by the Skoll Foundation. It's a centre for social enterprise. I mean, this is something that embodied in Skoll within the SIDE experience, but this notion of sort of purpose, and many more applicants perhaps in today's applicant pools for business school that are thinking about social enterprise, business. INSEAD now has its Centre for Business as a Force for Good. Yeah. At Rotterdam School of Management, they talk about, a force for positive change. Is that something, Caroline, that you've really seen in the sort of the stories or perhaps the goals of applicants to business schools, that a changing sense of purpose?
Yes, definitely. It is quite different now compared to, I would say 15, 20 years ago. It's much more common to see candidates talking in their applications and their interviews about their desire to have a positive impact and their interest in sustainability and the environment, and not just doing well in their careers, but helping a community as well. That is much more common. And so the schools have really responded to that, as you said. They've built these additional centres and electives and so on to cultivate those interests and enable students to pursue those interests and take it a step further and really integrate it into their careers.
Mm. Well, it's 9% coming from the non-profit background. So interesting how those a slightly different profile that's going into the SIDE program. Now, if you state a passion, that sort of sense of purpose, presumably you better be able to back it up. If you talk about, well, coming out of business school, I'm going to, eradicate poverty, I'm, going to affect global climate change, combat all of that. But then as an admissions office, are you then looking for that evidence rather than it just coming from out of thin air?
So you want to see some sort of logical thread. It's fine to have the ambition to make a big career change. And that's, frankly, why a lot of people going to business school is to make, substantial career change. But there needs to be, some connection with what you've done before, so that the school can see that, it therefore appears more genuine, that it's in some way it's an evolution of your path. And also they're thinking about, well, how will you look to a future recruiter, and will you be a credible candidate, and will you have something that you can talk about that you can leverage from your previous experience? So it doesn't have to be the core part of what you've done professionally, but if you can somehow find an aspect of what you've done in work or outside of work that relates to your future interests, that just helps to give it more weight and credibility.
Great. Right, so we'll be mindful of time. Natural, of course, that we would include Cambridge and, of course, your undergrad years.
That's right.
The Judge program, which is in the heart of what we now describe as Silicon Fen, this very dynamic entrepreneurial ecosystem. When you get out of the train station, the labs, the incubators, buildings that have just sprung up around Cambridge, you'd hardly recognize, and I guess that feeds into a very entrepreneurially minded business school too.
That's right, yes, and the school has invested a lot in sort of cultivating that ecosystem, and there are benefits to being part of a very substantial institution that has such sort of depth and breadth across the board that enables it to cultivate that kind of ecosystem in the same way that Stanford has been able to, obviously. So it's wonderful for students coming into that environment to be able to tap into that,
right.
And certainly a lot of people with entrepreneurial ambitions looking to this particular school.
Right. Now, Conrad Chua, who is a wonderful, very thoughtful member of the business school community, who was admissions director at Cambridge Judge. I remember him once talking about a candidate must have come up to him and he said, Conrad, your average GPA at Judge is whatever, 3.4, 3.5. I have a 3.4. Your average GMAT is 690. I have a 690. And he went through all of these data points and said, so you see, I'm perfect for your program. And it was a very salient reminder that these are averages. I mean, if schools published that the average height of their incoming students was whatever, 5'5", 5'11", then you try to match that too. These are broad indicators. I think you've spoken to that, and just everybody has an individual story, and that's really what you're trying to then share, I guess, to stand out in your particular industry, in your particular background, and your particular profile.
That's absolutely right. And schools are somewhat nervous sometimes about publishing these statistics, because they do not want people to think you have to conform to the average for each of these data points in order to get into the school. And as we've talked about, they are looking for that breadth of diversity. So whilst there will be certain profiles that are more common than others because of the nature of the applicant pool and the people applying to the school, people who don't fit that exact mold should not at all be discouraged from applying. And so and as we've said, often having a different profile is an advantage rather than a disadvantage.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm just starting to look at some of the absolutely fantastic and very thought-provoking questions that we've got, but we've just got 2 or 3 more schools to take a look at, and of course, HEC Paris is kind of the who's who of business in France. I think 25% of the CEOs of the CAC 40 are HEC graduates, one of the grandes écoles. It's about 15 kilometers outside of the city of Paris in Jouy-en-Josas. The course length is a distinct feature. They feel that this is just right. 16 months. And what does that include? I think that there's a company project that you can include in the 16 months.
Yes, and so it's got some additional options that you wouldn't necessarily find, as you say, in the sort of the more condensed 1-year formats, and they've specifically designed that so that you have that academic experience, but you also get some more of the practical experience integrated into the program, and it's a really interesting mix, and quite distinctive, as you say, in the market.
Right, and you've said before, the 1-year program it's sort of almost over before before you know it. I guess with a few additional months, it also gives time for some of the partnerships that they enjoy with schools around the world. It's trying to fit it all in. The number of MBA applicants that have said, if I could meet myself again on the first day, it would be pace yourself, prioritize, this fear of missing out. There's so much to do that's packed into this year or year and a half long experience. Yes,
it does help, as you say, to think through your priorities up front, because you can't do everything, right? Especially on these intensive programs. There are so many opportunities academically, socially, all of the clubs, the treks, etc., etc. So you need to think very carefully about what your goals are and focus your time, because there's no way that even if you don't sleep, you won't be able to do everything.
Right. Now, HEC Paris, their MBA has enjoyed great success in the FT rankings, The Economist, also in the last 2-3 years in particular. A class act, a great campus experience. It's tough, right? There are so many good choices. Sometimes people will say, well, maybe that school only really works if I speak French. Has your experience been that it is opening international doors? When we look at sort of employment rates?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very international student body, and they've worked hard to develop those relationships with recruiters around the world. So absolutely, and a lot of people are applying to to HEC, to INSEAD, London Business School. It's quite a similar applicant pool, right? It's there's a lot of overlap in the admissions pool. Similarly diverse student body looking to go and work all around the world. And so whilst the master's program and the original HEC program for people going to the sort of the French Grande École, they fed very much into the French market. This MBA program is quite different and is feeding into a much more international market.
Right. One of our viewers has asked about that sort of distinction. He's nearly 2 years out from undergraduate, the master's in management, that more sort of pre-experience or early career stage, versus the MBA. You reminded me, of course, that HEC, among many European schools, that really started with the master's in management as their flagship program. But it is for that earlier stage of your career. Typically, it's up to 2 years, and beyond which it would be the full-time MBA program.
Yes, yeah. So the masters in management are typically targeted at people who are, more or less just coming out of college and maybe have a year's work experience, or maybe by the time they start the program, they would have up to 2 years. But beyond that, then you're probably better off targeting the MBA program.
Right. In terms of language requirements, no doubt Spanish, if you're in Madrid or Barcelona, you'll get so much more out of the experience. And similarly at HEC, INSEAD has a 3-language requirement by the time that you graduate. But French doesn't have to be one of those languages.
No, that's right. It's right. And people sometimes think that, they're going to go to INSEAD and perfect their French, and then actually... it's a very English-speaking environment, but you, as you say, you do need to have, a working knowledge of a second language and a basic knowledge of a third language. And it doesn't have to be French. I mean, some people attend INSEAD and they never go to France, right? Because they may stay on the Singapore campus. So French may be completely irrelevant for them. So it doesn't have to be any particular language at all.
Right. Well, languages always open doors. So it will open the door for those looking at China and its extraordinary growth story of the last 37 years. CEBS is this partnership between China, Europe, and the EFMD to create a program that has really come onto the international scene. It's been in the top 10 in the FT rankings now for several years. I guess they could think about it, what course length will we have? Well, they decided somewhere between North American and European options. They went for a year and a half, but embedded in that lots of exchanges with other top business schools around the world. Do you see a growing demand for that boots on the ground experience in Asia, Caroline?
Well, so I think this is a great program for someone who is focused on Asia Pacific. So most of the students are from that region or working in that region already and looking to access career opportunities in Asia Pacific. And of course, as you mentioned, tremendous growth rates in that region. So, if you do have a specific interest in China or, Asia more broadly, it's a fantastic program. I know some faculty from INSEAD and other schools who've got involved in the school and love teaching there. It's very much an up and coming school, but for the time being somewhat more regionally focused. Although of course that's probably the hottest region of the world to be in economically. So very exciting opportunities for people who are looking to explore that and to perhaps make a switch into that job market.
Yes, yeah, I think it's an example where I'm sure that this will change over time. Right now, I think student representation, they talk about 26 nationalities in the program, many more, I think, drawn from the Asia Pac region, just a handful of European or North American, South American students in the program. So as you said, it really is looking to provide that boost for next steps in Asia and such a dynamic economy. There are other examples, with Singapore, not only home to INSEAD, but NUS and Nanyang, and then just north of them in Kuala Lumpur, a fascinating project that involves MIT Sloan with the Asia School of Business and a wonderful dean, Sean Ferguson, who runs that program. So, it does feel that, Asia has really come of age in terms of world-class full-time MBA programs. And I think this is a trend that's just going to grow and grow.
Yeah, I agree. I think we'll see a lot of growth in student interest in studying in this region, and that over time it will become much more global rather than regionally focused.
Which then leaves us with the many other options, and we didn't have the time to look at the likes of Bocconi or MIP in Milan, Imperial College right in the heart of London, ISADE, another of the top Spanish business schools, ESMT, not EMST, but ESMT that has emerged in Berlin. Germany was kind of late to the business school party, but they've really anchored themselves, and again, some of those great options across Asia, including the India School of Business in Hyderabad. So in terms of, I guess, where does that leave us? We've talked admissions throughout each of these slides, but I guess this sort of brings it all together as the viewers think about program choices. So maybe you can just take us through some of these different points of how to best evaluate in a two-way evaluation, schools that are looking at you, but just as importantly, you making the right choice for yourself.
Yes, yeah. So I think it's important, initially when you first start to think about business school, not to jump to any conclusions about where you should apply. And sometimes candidates look at the MBA rankings and then immediately make an assumption about the school that they should go to. Or perhaps, they look at the business schools that their colleagues have been to and assume that they should go to the same school. But I would encourage you certainly you can use the rankings as a sort of initial starting point and do some, look into the methodology and they collect some tremendous data. So that looking into that data can be very helpful. But really invest some time in your own research and look at the academic program, the on-campus recruiting. Which are the companies that are coming to campus to recruit? Which offices are they recruiting for? A lot of candidates need to spend some time reflecting a lot on their own career goals, because sometimes people know, well, I definitely know I want to go to business school. I think I'll get a lot out of the program, but they haven't necessarily figured out what it is that they want to do post MBA. And of course, a lot of people will change their mind about what they want to do post MBA during the program. And that was my case, right? When I applied to INSEAD, my goal was to go and work in the media industry in France. And then when I graduated, I ended up working for the World Bank Group in Indonesia. So absolutely nothing to do with what I said I was going to do. And schools understand that you will go through a transformation on the program. But still, it's helpful to have thought through, what your options might be and what you might be targeting. And as you said earlier, delve into those recruitment statistics. Don't just look at the headline numbers, but really, do scrutinize the data. Think about the right length for you. Some people love that 1 year format and the benefits of getting your MBA in 1 year rather than 2, or a shorter format rather than a longer format. But some people do need those 2 years and love having that time to take a lot of different electives and to spend more time thinking about their career options and networking and doing internships and so on. So, there are pros and cons for sure of both formats. So think carefully about which is the right option for you. Different MBA programs have a lot of different academic options, electives. So if you do have a specific interest in a specific sector or career path, do look at whether the curriculum will support that. And some schools may have more electives that are relevant for you than others. So and typically they have a lot of different electives. So spend some time, reading about those, as well as everything else that will be going on campus. A big part of the experience is outside of the classroom, right? A lot of what you will gain will be through the participation in all the other student activities that are going on campus. And also, when you graduate as part of the alumni community. And so, normally in normal times, I would encourage candidates to go to the campus if you possibly can, because there's no replacement really for just being there and soaking up the atmosphere and chatting to people on campus. That's more difficult, obviously, right now, and hopefully sometime in the not too distant future will be possible again. But don't sort of shortchange yourself on that research because you can't visit campus. All the schools are doing a lot of events online, so make the effort to sign up for those. Reach out to alumni, reach out to students. People are very happy to talk to future candidates and prospective candidates and talk about their experience. And having, multiple conversations like that, you'll get a lot of different input and perspectives on, because everybody has a different experience of a school. Everyone has a different path through the school and afterwards. And so, having a multitude of those conversations will really, inform your own thinking and make you actually a much better candidate, a much better prepared candidate.
Right. Yeah, it's, as you say, sort of really thoughtful and personally applied research, to make the right choices for you. Let's, fingers crossed that as we approach the second half of the year, that travel and partaking in those campus visits becomes available again. It's not a disqualifier. No school will look at you and either worse if you didn't visit the campus. It's simply that, as you said earlier, it gives you the chance to sort of soak in the environment and really get a sense of the institution.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they won't hold it against you. It's just really for your own benefit, for sure.
Right. So I guess the idea of showing your international credentials, you may not have worked in a bank in Zurich for 2 years, or your studies that involved an exchange program, part of your childhood, but was in a different part of the world. But there are many ways to show the sort of global mindset that really thrives in these in international schools.
Yes, that's right. So if you do have international experience, that's great, and you should certainly talk about it in your applications. If you don't have much international experience, or very, very limited, or perhaps none at all, you still need to show why it's relevant for you to be part of a very international community. And so, perhaps in your work, whilst you may not have traveled, or you may not have traveled much, perhaps you've worked with international colleagues, perhaps you've worked, virtually as part of a global team. So really draw on those examples in your application and also in your interviews. And also, think about how you can convey how being part of an international network will be relevant for your future career, and how you're going to, benefit from that and actually, use that going forward. So talk about why you're motivated to be in that sort of international learning environment, what you hope to gain from that, and then how you're going to leverage that going going forward, because schools want to bring students in who are really going to benefit from the program and actually be able to achieve their goals. So, if that international dimension is not a really strong part of your background, think about how you can show about how, it's a strong part of your future, hopefully.
Right. And of course, making sure that if you're applying to one school in London and another in Lausanne, in either case, of course, you're really capturing in the application, what it is specific, why this is the top choice for me. Do you think candidates go far enough in sort of illustrating and demonstrating that, that close alignment with an institution?
Well, sometimes not. And, it can feel a little bit artificial and like a sort of a hoop that you have to jump through, because, realistically, most candidates applying to more than one school, right? And we would not advise you to only apply to one school if you want to do an MBA. But you do have to show the love. You do have to make them feel like you're genuinely motivated. And so, there's different ways that you can weave that in. You can talk about, the location and why that is relevant to you. You can talk about, specific parts of the curriculum and how that's relevant to your interests. You can talk about the alumni community and, how motivated you are to be part of that in the future. So a lot of different aspects to a program, and think about, what really resonates with you and how you can weave that into your application. And then, certainly at the interview stage, they'll be looking to, understand your motivation more clearly. Right. And all the research that we talked about, it's really important to have done that research. That will stand you in very good stead. Sometimes in the application, the written application, you can kind of fake it. You can throw in a few names of professors and say, why you really want to be in London or Singapore or wherever it is. And not necessarily have done a huge amount of research, but you can't get through the interview on the basis of very superficial knowledge of the school, because they will want to probe on your motivation and how have you learned about the school. So even if you don't necessarily need it for the written part of the application, for sure you'll need to have that in-depth knowledge and sense of connection with the school to communicate at the interview stage.
Right. Wow. I can't, the number of insights that you've shared in the last 75 minutes, it's just fantastic. Perhaps I can sort of select through the many interesting questions that we've had. Some I think we've already touched upon. One interesting one, we talked about demand for Canadian European business schools that has seen this increase in the years. It's not just limited to how the Trump administration and tighter restrictions, or at least the rhetoric around attitudes towards the H-1B visa. Do you see now with Biden, Harris settled into the White House and far more positive in their outlook on international students, do you think that Canadian and European business schools will continue to see really strong applicant volume?
Yeah, I think the US schools are hugely relieved that there's a more positive environment now. And I think that will definitely help them attract international applicants. And I think, there has been some hesitancy, as you said, to apply to the US. And now that's changing. So that, that's good for the US schools. And it's great for people, who have that ambition to study in the US. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I don't see a drop in interest for those international programs, right. Because those schools have gone from strength to strength, and they have very strong faculty, they have great student bodies, they have access to these international recruitment opportunities, and so that still holds a very strong appeal. Right. So I think that that those international programs will continue to be an increasing percentage of seeing increasing level of interest from candidates really around the world.
Right, yeah, and business education really, has been such a growth area over the last 20, 30 years, which looks set to continue. Lots of options, I'm sure, that will continue to emerge, including online studies, but very selective. And Abhijit, who writes in to say, in addition to his 4 years of professional experience, he has a 600 on the GMAT. What are his chances in the top European and US business schools. It's not going to happen, Caroline, with 600. I mean, you talked about a range of scores, but given the selectivity of these top European and US programs, 600 is just, you're going to have to take that test again and find at least another 80 points, possibly more, based on sort of demographic background.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I mean, it is a very competitive process, and application volumes are pretty high right now. You know, we've seen an increase in application volume since the start of the pandemic, and you know, that seems to be continuing through this year. So you really have to make a big effort to put your best foot forward. And you know, the GMAT and the GRE is one data point where you have a bit more control than some other aspects in your profile, right? You can't go back and change your undergraduate GPA. You can't, you know, necessarily change your whole professional trajectory to date, although, you know, you may be able to shape your current experience. But the GMAT is something where you do have control. And so, you know, I would certainly encourage candidates to invest the time and effort to do as well as they possibly can on that, and not make assumptions about, you know, the rest of their profile being strong enough to compensate for a very weak test score.
Right. And in terms of other qualifications, you know, CFA levels 1, 2, and 3, or chartered accountancy exams, all of these, how would you assess the sort of incremental value? Certainly, you know, CFA, even starting with level 1, will share with schools an ability to handle numbers. Do you think that they, you know, genuinely help applicants to stand out?
Yes, they do. They do. They help to bolster your academic credentials, and you know, especially so if your quant score on the GMAT or the GRE is a little bit weak, but you've got one of those qualifications that you mentioned, then that for sure that helps. But it will compensate to a certain extent, right? So it's not going to, you know, if your quant score is, you know, 20 percentile points below where it should be, the CFA may help, but it may not be enough to get you sort of over that borderline. So, but it definitely, you know, it enhances your credentials overall for sure, and they do take it into account.
Right. With the uncertainties of the last year and the impact of the pandemic, of course, some people have found that they're not working at the time of applying to business school, and so if you're out of work at the time of applying, in the last year, I'd imagine schools have tremendous understanding. You know, hospitality industry, aviation industry that have been hit so hard. Yeah. What about other gaps in your resume?
Yeah, so schools are understanding, right? And the best thing is to explain what happened, right? Sometimes, you know, I've seen applications where candidates have kind of sort of swept it under the carpet and hope the school won't notice that there's this 6-month gap or something somewhere along the line. And they do notice, right? And they're going to come back to you and ask you about it. So it's better to just be proactive and explain what happened. And, you know, admissions officers are human. They don't expect you to have had, you know, the perfect track record. And they also understand that, you know, things happen in the economy, and that, you know, they also read the newspapers and they understand what's gone on over the last 12 months. So they understand that, you know, you might have been laid off, and it is no reflection at all on your performance and how well regarded you are. But it's really, you know, a factor of the dynamics in your industry. So that's absolutely fine, and they are very forgiving. But just explain what happened and be clear about it.
Right, and you know, just making sure that people understand. So someone has 7 years working as a freelancer since graduating, and is saying, you know, does that count? It very much does count, right? If you've successfully run your own private business. You'll be leveraging it in a different way from, say, the position that you might have in a Fortune 500 company, but it can still distill that into great experience.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And sometimes, you know, people come from very different backgrounds. As you say, you know, someone who's been working as a freelancer, don't discount by any means the value of that experience. And think about, you know, the skills that you've built, and you know, how you can convey the quality of the experience that you've had and the exposure you've had, and perhaps the experience in sales and you know, dealing with clients and all of that great experience where you've had to be very autonomous, and not necessarily had the benefits of a large organization that's supporting you all of the time. So don't feel necessarily that your background is a disadvantage, and think about how you can actually play up the positive of what you bring to the table.
Right, and similarly, if you've come from an engineering background, you have no, you've been focused on manufacturing, you've got no management, finance, business knowledge. That's fine too. That's one of the reasons you're then pursuing the MBA to broaden out those skills.
Yes, yeah. I mean, a lot of it's a very a well-trodden path, right? For someone from an engineering background going to business school, and so schools absolutely understand the rationale for doing that. And they're not expecting you to have all of that sort of prior business knowledge and necessarily in finance experience. But when you're applying, try not to get too bogged down in the technical details of your role and what you've done. Sometimes engineers sort of make assumptions about what the file reader may know about their sector and their product and the technology, and you can lose someone quite easily if they're not familiar. So think about rather than talking too much about the technical aspects of your role, think about talking about the impact that you've had and perhaps how you've worked effectively with a team. So think about those transferable skills that will be relevant to the classroom and also relevant to your future career, and how you can communicate those in your application.
Right. One final question for you, Caroline, and thank you. You've taken so much time to share, a broad range of questions. We talked about, early stage, the Masters in Management versus the MBA, but someone that perhaps has 10 years of experience, early 30s, would prefer the full-time than the exec MBA. Perhaps just one or two pointers. You've written an article that's been read by 250,000 people about the over 30s applying to business school. You talk about the importance of the post-MBA career goals that you share?
Yes, that's right. So for someone who is on the older side, so you can still be a very credible candidate for a full-time program, but the older candidates who typically get into the full-time programs often have a somewhat non-traditional path. So they're not typically, your management consultants who've worked in consulting for 10 years, or investment bankers who've been working in finance for 10 years and then going back to business school. They're often people who have taken different paths, maybe, journalists, lawyers, lots of different, incredible diversity actually of those profiles particularly. And so, I think if you've got a lot of work experience, you can be more credible if you're sort of talking about making a career switch. And the MBA, the full-time MBA, can be better suited to doing that kind of sort of fundamental career switch than an executive MBA, where often people are sort of continuing in their role and looking for career acceleration rather than career change. But also think carefully about where, which student community will be the best fit for you, because sometimes older candidates might actually be better off going for the executive MBA because they'll be in a peer group where they'll be with people who have a similar level of experience, or really impressive leadership experience, and that can be a wonderful group to tap into as well. So if you're at that sort of cusp where you could go either way, I would think carefully about both options, because sometimes an older student could get a little bit frustrated in a classroom where there will be people who have only 2 years work experience and they're sort of 23, 24 years old, and you may be in a team with them, and they might not have the same level of maturity as you. So perhaps you actually would enjoy more being in an executive MBA environment where you're with people who you feel a greater sense of fit.
Right. And I guess having talked about the London Business School, of course, they're one of 3 outstanding business schools with a Sloan program. Stanford now calls it the MSX. There's the Sloan Fellows at MIT, and then the Sloan program at London Business School. That's more sort of mid-30s onwards.
That's right.
A full 1 year full-time program. Well, I guess we're coming to an end. I know that subscribing to GMAT Club. Perhaps there were a couple of questions we didn't get to. You know, where might you study healthcare at top European business schools and the best schools for technology? Certainly with a 2-year experience, I think, you know, it gives opportunities. For example, the HCM program at Wharton, Kellogg, Columbia, Duke. There are a number of great schools with really strong healthcare programs. With many of the European schools, that 1-year general management focus, there are electives available to you, but perhaps you see fewer in those sort of fields. You've also asked about technology. Looking at schools and the relationship to the wider university. You see this, of course, with Sloan and its relationship to MIT. It's certainly true for schools like Haas at Berkeley, the GSB with the rest of Stanford University. And there are equivalents. You know, there are a number of the top engineering schools in Europe that don't have a business school, but there's some that do. Imperial College Business School is one example. MIP with Politecnico di Milano in Milan. And then where you see schools like HEC building relationships with École Polytechnique. And that, I think, is this fusion of business and technology that the likes of Carnegie Mellon, Tepper, and others can achieve. So perhaps more than we've got time for, but you know, thank you for staying with us, asking so many great questions. And particularly, Caroline, thank you to you. I've kept you talking for about an hour and a half, and I think it's essential viewing. There's so much guidance and insight through everything that we've talked about during that time. So thank you very much. Thank you to the viewers. Thank you for GMAT Club for hosting us. And do remember to subscribe and follow GMAT Club on YouTube. And have a safe and fun rest of the day wherever you are in the world.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Matt. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.